I never believed in ghosts. That was before my experience on Flight 369, a red-eye flight from New York to London. I boarded the plane late at night, half asleep already, hoping to doze off as soon as we were airborne. Little did I know, sleep would be the last thing I'd get on that flight. It started with small things. I had the window seat, and next to me was an older woman, knitting quietly. She smiled politely, but something about her seemed off. Her knitting needles moved fast, almost too fast. She barely looked down, her hands working in an eerie, mechanical rhythm. I thought nothing of it at first, thinking I was just tired. Once the plane reached cruising altitude, the lights dimmed. People around me were settling in, some already asleep, while others flipped through magazines or watched movies. I closed my eyes, trying to rest, but an odd chill made me shiver. I reached for the air vent above me, twisting it to stop the cool air. But when I looked down, I could still see my breath fogging in the air. I felt a prickling on the back of my neck, like someone was watching me. I glanced to my right, and the woman beside me was gone. Her knitting needles were there, resting on her lap as if she'd just put them down, but she was nowhere to be seen. I looked around, thinking she'd gone to the restroom. But minutes passed, and she didn't come back. I looked down the aisle, scanning the rows of seats. She wasn't there. Trying to brush it off, I told myself I'd just missed her when she left. I leaned back and closed my eyes again, hoping to get some sleep. But then I felt a tap on my shoulder. My heart leapt, and I turned, expecting to see her back in her seat. But no one was there. After that, I couldn't relax. I got up and walked down the aisle to stretch my legs. On my way to the restroom, I noticed that several people looked uneasy. One woman clutched her husband's arm, looking around nervously. Another man seemed to be muttering to himself, his eyes wide and darting around the cabin. I chalked it up to nerves. Maybe they were just anxious about flying. I reached the restroom, and when I looked into the small mirror above the sink, I froze. Behind me, there was a figure, a tall man with dark, empty eyes, standing just inches away from me. His face was pale, and his mouth was twisted in a way that made my stomach turn. I whipped around, but the restroom was empty. I stared into the mirror, waiting for him to appear again, but there was only my own horrified face staring back. When I returned to my seat, the strange feeling in the air had only intensified. I sat down, but as soon as I did, I began to hear faint whispers. I couldn't make out any words, but the whispers sounded desperate, almost pleading. I looked around, but everyone seemed to be minding their own business. The whispers grew louder, making my head throb. The sound seemed to be coming from all around me, like a low hum of voices overlapping. I leaned toward the aisle, trying to find the source, and that's when I noticed something strange. Several passengers had blank expressions, staring straight ahead, completely unblinking. I watched, feeling a rising panic as they sat frozen, hands on their laps, eyes wide open but empty. It was as if they were in a trance. A flight attendant walked by and I tried to get her attention. "Excuse me," I whispered. "Is everything all right?" "People are. They're acting strange." She looked at me, her face expressionless, and nodded slowly. But as she walked down the aisle, I watched in horror as she seemed to fade. Her figure became transparent until I could see the empty seats behind her. I blinked, thinking I was seeing things, but when I looked again, she was gone. It was as if she had vanished into thin air. I sat back, my heart racing. This couldn't be real. I grabbed my armrest, trying to convince myself that I was just imagining things. But every time I closed my eyes, I could see those blank, staring faces. Just when I thought things couldn't get any worse, I felt a cold hand on my shoulder. I froze, too terrified to turn around. The hand gripped me tighter, and I heard a voice, a low, raspy whisper right next to my ear. "Don't look back." The voice was hoarse, filled with a warning that sent a shiver down my spine. I didn't move. I couldn't even breathe. Then, as suddenly as it had come, the hand released me, and the voice was gone. Slowly, I turned back around. The woman who had been sitting next to me was back in her seat, her knitting needles clicking away as if she had never left. She looked over at me and smiled, her face calm and friendly, but her eyes were cold, almost dead. The plane began its descent, and I could feel the tension in the cabin ease a bit. The whispers faded, and the passengers who had been sitting in a trance seemed to wake up blinking and looking around as if they had just come back to themselves. I could see the confusion in their eyes, but no one spoke of it. When we landed, I practically ran off the plane, too afraid to look back. I wanted to put as much distance as possible between myself and that haunted flight. To this day, I don't know what I experienced on Flight 369, but I've never set foot on another plane since. And every time I think back to that night, I can still feel that cold hand on my shoulder and hear that warning whisper. As I finally stepped off the plane, I felt a wave of relief wash over me. The busy, noisy airport was a welcome sight after the surreal nightmare in that quiet, eerie cabin. My legs felt shaky, and my hands were clammy as I gripped my carry-on, heading straight for the exit. I kept glancing back, afraid I'd see those blank-eyed passengers or that shadowy figure from the restroom mirror following me out. When I reached the arrivals area, I was tempted to tell someone what had happened to flight attendant, the pilot, anyone. But I couldn't bring myself to do it. Who would believe me? I could hardly believe it myself. Maybe it was just fatigue, I told myself. Maybe my mind had been playing tricks on me. But the strange experiences didn't end when I left the plane. Back at my hotel that night, I tossed and turned, unable to shake the feeling that something from the flight had followed me. When I closed my eyes, I saw those blank stares, the woman knitting in eerie silence, the tall man with dark eyes in the mirror. The more I tried to forget, the more vivid the memories became, as if they were seared into my mind. Around 3 a.m., I awoke to the sound of whispering. It was the same low hum I'd heard on the plane. My heart raced as I sat up, clutching the blankets. The whispers seemed to be coming from the corner of the room. Slowly I turned my head, but there was nothing there, just shadows in the dim light from the street outside. I lay back down, but the whispering continued, growing louder until it sounded like a dozen voices overlapping. I squeezed my eyes shut, hoping it would stop, and eventually, after what felt like hours, it did. I spent the rest of the night lying wide awake, too terrified to sleep. The next day, as I prepared to leave the hotel, I noticed something strange in my bag. I reached in, thinking I'd packed an extra book by mistake, but the book that I pulled out wasn't mine. It was the same old, leather-bound book the flight attendant had found on the empty seat. I froze, staring at the familiar, worn cover. With trembling hands, I opened it. The pages were filled with more of those strange symbols, the ones I couldn't understand. But as I flipped through, I noticed something different. Some of the pages had names written on them, scrawled hastily, as if in a hurry. My heart dropped when I saw a familiar name, Henry Porter. He had been sitting a few rows behind me on the plane. I had seen him just before takeoff, flipping through a magazine. Then another name caught my eye, Linda Carter. She was the woman in seat 12C, the one who had looked pale and frightened. I turned the pages faster, and with each name I remembered another face from that haunting flight. Each name was scratched into the book, as if they were trapped there forever. When I reached the last page, I froze. My own name was there, written in shaky letters, Alex Michaels. My breath caught in my throat, and I dropped the book, stumbling back in horror. This couldn't be happening. I hadn't put that book in my bag. And yet, here it was, holding names of people who had been on the same flight, names that seemed like a grim record. I wanted to throw the book away, but every time I tried, something held me back, a feeling deep down that if I left it behind, the haunting would only grow stronger. So I took it with me, hoping that somehow I'd find a way to rid myself of it. Days turned into weeks, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was still with me. Shadows in my apartment would seem to shift at night, and whispers would fill the room when I was alone. Sometimes I'd hear that same voice again, the cold whisper that had warned me on the plane, saying, "Don't look back." It became a mantra I lived by, something I tried to follow religiously, even when I felt eyes on me from the empty rooms behind. One night, desperate for answers, I took the book to a friend of mine who was interested in the paranormal. He examined it carefully, flipping through the pages and scanning the symbols with a frown. After a long pause, he looked up, his face pale. These symbols, they're marks, binding symbols. This book is like a ledger, a record of people who've crossed paths with something, a force, maybe a spirit, trying to hold on to the living. He explained that if my name was in that book, it meant that the spirit of Flight 369 might still be watching, trying to pull me back, like it had with the others. My blood ran cold at his words. All I could think of was that flight attendant vanishing, the blank stares of the passengers, and the strange, warning voice. With my friend's help, we planned a ritual to break the connection with the book, something he claimed would sever the spirit's link to me. But there was one final step that made my stomach turn. To break free, I had to relive every moment of that flight, to face each memory without looking back, even when I felt the spirit's presence. That night, we started the ritual, and I closed my eyes, forcing myself to remember every detail: the cold air, the fading flight attendant, the man in the mirror. At the end, the whispers began again, louder and louder, almost a scream in my ears. My instinct screamed at me to turn around, to look back. But I remembered the voice's warning and kept my gaze forward, fighting the pull of the shadowy memories. Suddenly, the room fell silent. The whispers stopped, and a calm, almost peaceful feeling washed over me. When I opened my eyes, the book was gone, leaving only a faint, dark mark on the floor where it had been. It's been years since Flight 369, and I haven't stepped onto a plane since. The memories still linger, but the haunting presence has faded, leaving only a sense of relief. Sometimes, when I'm alone at night, I still feel that chill, and I hear a faint whisper in my ear, a reminder of the terror of that night. But I never look back.